Thanks for joining, everyone. So if you haven't attended one of these before, this is a space resources education webinar that myself and our co-chair, Jared Longfox, started about 2 years ago. So we are co-chairs of the AIAA Space Resources Education and Outreach pillar. And our goal is to really sort of disseminate information about space resources to a wider audience, whether that be technical or more general sort of public. And when we started, we kind of started with some space agencies like NASA to sort of lay the framework, and then we've gone through more technical presentations on sort of the execution of that vision and the framework that the agencies outlines. But I'm really excited today for Dr. Antonino Salmeri to talk about the legal aspects of this. So this is a new angle for the webinar series, and I think it's a very important consideration now that we've kind of talked through them. So if you want to look back through, we have a recording of each of the webinars. They're on the AIAA Space Resources Chapter YouTube channel, so this will also be posted there after. And also excited that this lines up a little more with the European and Australian time zones. We're normally in the US time zone. So without further ado, actually, sorry, one more thing. If you have questions, there's a Q&A, little chat button at the bottom of the Zoom. Just enter your questions as you think of them into the chat. The webinar will be about 45 minutes. So I'll have 15 minutes of questions at the end. So just, again, enter them as you think of them, and I'll read them out at the end. So now, without further ado, Dr. Antonino, toss to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Joe. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining in the world. My name is Antonino, and I'm very delighted to be here. I'd like to thank AIAA for inviting me to participate in this very prestigious and interesting and timely, and I think very useful as well, webinar series on space resources. And today we're going to talk about the legal and policy aspects of lunar mining, which is my area of expertise. So let's begin into it. During the talk, if you have any immediate question that you have, try to type it in. If something is not clear and it doesn't make sense, I'll obviously want to take note of that. So please do feel free to share any immediate reaction as well as questions for the end. As Joe said, we're gonna leave about 10-15 minutes for Q&A. I'm very sorry that it's not like as dynamic as one might like, because you cannot unmute yourself and speak, but we're going to look at your questions through the Q&A function. So what are we going to do today, and what is different perhaps a little bit about this talk? We're going to look at legal and policy aspects of lunar mining, and we're going to do that in 3 different parts. First, we're going to have a quick recap of the practical context. And this is not because I have to tell you about it, in the sense that, as Joe said, people that have been following the series probably know everything already that's need to know. But I think what I'm going to say about the legal and policy developments makes more sense if we have a little bit of a recap of what is that we're talking about. What is the lunar mining is it going to be, and what are the nuances that we need to keep in mind when then planning, what are the rules and what are the policies that we want to apply to that. Keeping in mind, and I think that's one of the mantra of my career, and one of the things that I try to convey whenever I talk, especially to a broader public, the law and policies are not there to stop any activity, including mining. They are there to enable them, and to enable them in harmony with the rest of the other activities we do in space, in accordance with the legal framework that we already have for that. So please don't see lawyers or policymakers are people that are trying to make it hard for you or make it difficult for people, let's say for humanity to progress or to innovate. It's quite the opposite. I think history tells us that whenever there has not been, let's say, a coordinated, harmonized approach to innovation, that becomes contested and it becomes more difficult to do business, to do science. So the reason why we're here, and the reason why we're going to think about legal and policy aspects of lunar mining, it's because they are needed so that lunar mining can happen in a peaceful, safe, and sustainable manner. At least that is my view. Of course, I'm happy if somebody disagrees and we can talk about it more. So we're going to start with the context, and we're going to go into what is the applicable legal framework that already exists, and how are we going to transform that legal framework into concrete rules for space mining through policy development. And then at the end, we are going to take questions, and hopefully this discussion will continue in the future as well. I guess we at AIAA, the webinar series will go on, and as well with anybody who is interested, they can share my contact and you can message me anytime. So if that all is clear, let's begin with some very, very short notes on what is it that we're going to talk about. Everybody wants to go back to the moon. I think today this is quite clear. When I started my career in this sector, it was not. It was still very uncertain whether there was any interest at all in going to the moon, and it was very uncertain whether it was feasible for us to go back to the moon in the way that we are now planning, which is a sustained and sustainable way. And it is interesting sometimes to touch upon the difference that in terminology that we use, for example, between the American and the European context as to what going to the moon sustainably means. Because like there is a certain interpretation of it, which means that we're going to go and stay. So we're going to sustain our presence. Doesn't really matter how or no matter the cost. And there is a sustainable approach, which means that we're going to be able to remain on the moon sustainably, which means with a certain consideration on how we're going to use the environment, how we're going to impact others. And in a certain sense, that differentiates a lot what kind of policies we want to develop, because what will sustain us is not necessarily sustainable for the environment at large or for other people that want to do perhaps different activities. So that is also an interesting element to take into account. Now, when we think about the moon and what we think will happen so far, it's a series of one-time missions, mostly of scientific nature. People ask me, for example, whether space mining is legal. And I answer that space mining has already happened. In history, it happened at least 3 to 4 times, not only on the moon, but also on asteroids. But on the moon specifically, the Apollo 11 astronauts were the first space miners, because they took resources, they collected them, and they brought them back home. Legally, there is not much of a difference between space mining as going and drill the surface of the moon and just collecting resources. The fundamental principle is the same. Then, of course, the consequences of it and making it sustainable are different. So the Apollo 11 astronauts, as well as the Chang'e 5 and Chang'e 6 missions, they all constitute a form of space resource activity, and they've all been considered to be legal under international space law. Nobody questioned the legality of these activities. However, this is not what we want to do on the moon. This is not what lunar mining in the general sense of it is understood by the broader public, as well by the industry that wants to develop it. We want to go to large-scale, long-term, and commercial operations. We have currently, let's say, 3 different types of vision for it. There is the Artemis program that is being led by NASA with international partners. There is the International Lunar Research Station, which is promoted by China and Roscosmos, and it has now, I think, about 8 to 10 countries that have been signing agreement with them to participate in the program. And then there is the approach of companies. What you see there is a rendering from old presentation of iSpace for a moon valley, but every different commercial actors has their own views and vision for what we should be doing on the moon. Now, these activities are something that we have never done in the past. The idea of going to the moon and develop infrastructure that's gonna stay there permanently and that will be used for a variety of purposes beyond science for a very long term, this is something that we haven't done and that we need to be prepared to regulate, but also to enable in a way that it's sustainable, safe, and peaceful. You have heard probably already, for example, that I think last summer, NASA released about 10 proposed or suggested landing sites for the Artemis missions that are going to land on the surface. And then CNSA had done that already a few months earlier, if I'm not wrong. And the 2 of them overlap, obviously, because some of the most scientific sites of interest or just some of the most convenient sites are the same for everybody. and they're all in the south pole of the moon, at least most of them. The question then becomes, if we all want to develop that infrastructure, if we all want to make use of that space, how are we going to coordinate with each other? How are we going to ensure that there is no interference, that there is no conflict, and obviously that we can stay there and prosper and ideally cooperate with each other? And the same goes with companies, which sometimes don't fit in any of these broader international programs, but they just want to do their own business on the moon. They want to conduct activities for creating a lunar economy, as we hear very often now. And this type of activity is also very different, because the purpose of the activity matters in terms of whether or not we as a community feel it's justified to allow them and how they're going to be regulated. But the real question is, bear in mind Mike Duke. Now, who is Mike Duke? Is former colleague from the Colorado School of Mines, and I have to give credit to my friend Angela Bud Madrid, who taught me, and I think taught the community, about the 3 fundamental steps that are needed for successful space resource activities. You need a recoverable resource, you need technology to recover it, and you need a customer. Now, here we're going to focus pretty much on number 1, which is the recoverable resource. And recoverable means many different things. It means that you have the legality to recover the resource, but also that you have found a resource that is recoverable because of the nature of the resource. Why I'm mentioning this? I'm mentioning this again to give us context. Do we have resource on the moon, or do we have reserves? If you go and talk to a mining company on Earth and you say that you want to start a business to do mining, they will ask you, show me your proven reserves. They will not ask you, did you find resources? Because in mining, there is a difference between the general distribution of resources and concentration of resources in a way that they are economically recoverable and legally recoverable and sellable to a third party. Now, where are we on the moon? Do we have resource or do we have reserves? Until we prove the existence of at least inferred reserves, there is no real business case for space mining. That's why the next couple of years of activities will be focused on proving the existence of these reserves through prospecting activities. But again, prospecting is not an activity that happens randomly or that happens chaotically. On Earth, it is regulated by very specific codes created not by the policymakers, but by the mining industry as such. Because every miner has the interest that everybody follows certain standards, so that we're playing fair, that there is a level playing field, and so that all the mining operations are equally credible. Before someone goes get a lot of money for a business that doesn't exist, and this destroys faith from the market, from the public in mining as such. And on the moon, this is a real risk that we need to keep in mind. So a colleague from iSpace, Carlos Espeyel, one of the first people to think about how are we going to translate what we already have in the mining industry for space mining. And he created something called Lunar Ore Reserve Standard, LORS. And the LORS is actually, at the moment, the only codification of how we're going to report on prospecting. And it's a starting point. It's a framework that has to be developed on what do we need to prove reserves on the moon. Beyond the effort of LORS, with several colleagues such as Clive Neal, Angela Bud Madrid, James Carpenter, Jerry Sanders, and others, you can find this later in the presentation, we are proposing something called an International Lunar Resource Prospecting Campaign. And bear in mind that name because we're going to revisit it at the end of the presentation. What I want you to keep in mind at this stage is, again, that we are talking about lunar mining, but we're not even sure that legal mining has a business case, that space mining has a business case on the moon, because we need to go to that proven reserve status. That is also the reason why the legal framework is not as developed as you may expect, because at this stage, we are still in a very preliminary phase. And there is a concept that is important to bear in mind, which is the idea of adaptive governance, right? So as many of you, I'm sure, will agree, we don't want to regulate too much in advance. We want the rules that we need to begin the activity and to make sure that the outlook of the activity is peaceful, safe, and sustainable. But those rules cannot go into what is unknown. First, we need to increase our knowledge of the lunar environment. And first, we need to know if the activity that we want to do is actually feasible from a technical and economical perspective, the 3 criteria to make sure that space mining is successful. So I'm gonna give you one moment to digest all this information, and then we're gonna start thinking about what are the rules that we currently have that are applicable to space mining and that we're gonna develop further for space mining. Okay, let's start to talk about the legal framework. The first thing you need to keep in mind is that space law is a multi-level system. So most of you might be familiar with international law, or you may be familiar with domestic law. Space law is a bit of both. That is a very special feature of space law. It is one that I invite you to keep in mind, simply because we're not going to have a competition between international regulation and national regulation. They have to integrate with each other, as they have already done for the past 50 years of space activities and space law. Space law exists since the very beginning of our journey into outer space. As soon as the Sputnik 1 was launched, the United Nations convened the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And this committee was convened first as an ad hoc committee, then it became a permanent committee of the UN General Assembly. And from the very beginning, states came together to say that they wanted to have certain principles applied to space. This was even before the first international agreement was adopted. This was 1963, where the so-called Declaration of Legal Principles was made. And this is where states came from to say, we think that space is different than other domains on Earth, and we want it to be peaceful, and we want it to be a domain of international cooperation. And we don't want it to be a domain of sovereignty. Bear this in mind. We're going to see it in a second. They came together, they created the fundamental treaties of international space law. It's 5 international agreements, and the most important of them is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is so-called the Magna Carta of space law. It's a treaty that is very well ratified. It is beyond 100 parties. All of them are the major spacefaring nations, including new nations, and it is the treaty that we're going to refer in this talk. I'm not going to comment on the other treaties that followed, which regulate specific aspects such as the rescue of astronauts and the return of objects. This is the Rescue and Return Agreement. The Liability Convention, which talks about liability for accidents happening in space. The Registration Convention, which talks about transparency and jurisdiction and control over space objects launched into outer space. And then finally, the Moon Agreement, which I know people in different countries have different feelings about. And we're not going to comment it here because the Moon Agreement is relevant for the parties to the Moon Agreement. And in this case, there are not so many. There are about 16, 17. And it is not what we would say custom international law, which is instead what is applicable in the Outer Space Treaty, and therefore will be relevant no matter if you ratified or not the Outer Space Treaty. It's fundamental principles that everybody will have to follow. Now, when states came together at the international level to think about the regulation of space law, they also thought about what about private activities? What about non-governmental actors in space? And this was a debate between, at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union and all the other countries. There were not so many interested in space at the time. And the debate was, should we allow private actors to be active in space, to have their own operations? Or should space be a domain only for states? Obviously, you can imagine which country held which position. You can find it in the proceedings of the Outer Space Treaty. But a compromise was found to say that, yes, private actors can operate in space under the supervision and the responsibility and the authorization of a country. This is what makes space a multi-level system, because in order to make sure that private actors can operate in space, international law has to be translated at the domestic level. And that is done normally through domestic legislation, which could be hard law, or it could be policies, or it could be licensing, depending on the framework of every country. But the important aspect is that domestic legislation is fundamental, because it's the way how we make sure that private actors are bound by the same rules of international space law. They're not directly applicable to private entities, but they are by means of international law, and they are by means of international responsibility, which means that it is an obligation for a state that has a national and interested in space activities to make sure that that private actor complies with the rules of international space law. It is not a choice. It is an obligation. And if that obligation is violated, the state will respond of the consequences with international responsibility, which is a serious consequence under international law. The two of them also integrate with each other because, of course, by means of domestic legislation, countries interpret and evolve and implement international space law. By its own nature, international space law, it's not very specific. It is a set of principles and general rules. It sets the boundaries. And then within those boundaries, states have the freedom to interpret, implement in a way that, of course, is not conflicting with those boundaries. So domestic legislation is not just an obligation to ensure that private actors comply with international law, but it's also a means of interpreting and evolving and implementing and applying international space law. So it comes back to international law because after years of practice, then our interpretation can change if there is a sufficient number of countries that propose it. And we can develop new rules based on the experience that we have at the domestic level. So the two of them work together in synergy. Ideally, there should be no conflict between domestic legislation and international space law. But we're going to revisit that in a moment. Now, this matrix gives you an understanding of the foundational principles of international space law. And I'm going to give you a second to take a look at the various principles. Each of them is derived from a different article of the Outer Space Treaty. It's not all of them. I put what are the most relevant for space mining, but you can take a look more in detail on these topics, of course, through literature and by reading yourself the Outer Space Treaty, which I invite you to do because it's not a difficult treaty to read, at least on a superficial level. So take a second to read and look at the fundamental principles of international space law. All right, we're not going to go into the details of each and every principle, but I want to spend a little bit more time to elaborate on them, and especially on the very, very foundational ones, which are laid down in Article 1 and Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. Article 1 is the article that defines the freedom to explore and use outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. This is the fundamental rule in space, that there is freedom. So states are free to explore and use outer space. Free means that a state, bear in mind, a state, not a private actor, a state doesn't need permission from anybody to venture into outer space. A state can just set up its space activities and launch into space. It doesn't need to go to the UN, it doesn't need to go to other countries, it just does it, and that's it. At the same time, this freedom is not unlimited. It's not an absolute freedom. It doesn't mean that you can really do whatever you want in space. It means that you can start your activity, but you need to respect fundamental conditions and limitations. Those are already laid down in Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty. So the same article that gives you the freedom, it also tells you that this freedom has to be used in certain ways. And there are conditions that are more strict. For example, the fact that there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies. This is a clear obligation that doesn't leave a lot of room for interpretation, although maybe we'll revisit later. And then there is more aspirational principles, such as, for example, the idea that the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. And then there is intermediate principles, which is the fact that space shall be explored and used on a basis of equality without discrimination of any kind, and of course, in accordance with international law. So, Article 1, we have freedom, but this freedom is already conditioned, let's say. If you don't respect the conditions, your freedom is not valid anymore. Therefore, you're not in a position to benefit in your space. If you go and want to claim the freedom, you have to respect the conditions of that freedom. Those conditions are also laid down beyond Article 1 throughout the entire Outer Space Treaty. The most important one, for the purposes of our discussion today, is Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall not be subject to national appropriation by any kind of means. Like, let's not list them. Article 2 has a list that is non-exclusive. It's just, let's say, explanatory, but it simply means that no state can go to the moon or go to Mars or an asteroid for what it's worth, because they are all celestial bodies, plant a little flag and say, this is my area. You can plant a flag, as countries have done, but it's symbolic. It doesn't give you any territorial control over that part of space. And that was a specific choice to avoid the mistakes of colonialism and to avoid that space becomes a domain of contestation between states that just run to plant a flag and exclude others. Space is a domain of inclusion, not exclusion. At least outer space, sometimes it is for its own very physical nature of it, because of orbits, for example. Orbital dynamics tells you that if I'm in an orbit, you cannot be. But the use of celestial bodies, it's a different story, right? Because of this specific prohibition of territorial appropriation. And this is an important question to keep in mind for how we're going to do space mining, and not in the sense that you may imagine. In the past, people were wondering whether Article 2, the prohibition of appropriation, would include would include space resources, whether that prohibits that you have property rights on space resources as such. I argue, and I wrote that in my PhD as well, for example, that I don't think that is the case. I think that Article 2 does not prevent you from owning a resource that you're able to extract from a celestial body. But I do believe that the prohibition in Article 2 constitutes, let's say, a preclusion, or in a certain way, it creates obstacles for the setting up of a large-scale mining operation. Because in order to do that, you will need to, let's say, exclusively operate on a portion of a celestial body that, if you control for a sufficiently long time, could be said to be de facto appropriated. That is mostly the problem. So the problem is not that you're going to go and get a resource and own the resource. The problem is, how are you going to do it in a way that doesn't give you substantial ownership of the territory, sovereignty of the territory, which you cannot get. So this is one of the conundrums that we need to solve about how do you set up a mining operation without sovereignty, without exclusive control of the territory that you're mining, because that is what we do on Earth. When you go on Earth, you get a mining permit, and then you get control over your area. Nobody else comes, and you get even police powers over your mining site because you want to protect precious resources. On the moon, on asteroids, that will not be possible, at least not with the current legal framework. So we will need to think about how we're going to allow mining to be conducted practically, despite Article 2, taking into account also what I said before, that there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies, right? And that is, again, a very, very specific prescription that it's hard to kind of reinterpret in a way that allows you to keep exclusive control of territory. So that's one of the open questions. The other principles touch upon the importance of international law. Like I said, space is not the Wild West, as some people might have told you. It's never been from the very beginning. It will never be. Space will always be a domain of international law, and by means of domestic legislation, also national law. And that is fundamentally clear to everybody active in space. So those principles also are not questioned. No one is going to the international fora like COP was to say, I don't agree anymore with Article 2 of the Aerospace Treaty, or I don't think there should be the rule of law in space. This is a given. This is the foundations that we start from. So again, bear in mind, we're not going to change the Aerospace Treaty tomorrow. This is the rules that we have to work with, and they are good rules. If space has become a flourishing environment, if space has become an economy that is going to reach $1 trillion in the next 10 years, it's because of these rules. It's because they created an environment that allows certainty, and certainty is fundamental to do any activity at this level of risk and at this level of technical difficulty and economical investment. So these are the foundational rules that we're going to play with. Another one that I want to just briefly touch upon is Article 4, which talks about the exclusively peaceful purposes for the use of the moon and other celestial bodies. This is an important distinction, for example, that exists between the use of orbits and the use of territory on celestial bodies. The use of orbit shall not be for aggressive purposes. So space should not be a domain for conflict, for active conflict, for confrontation among states in the sense of using weapons in space or using space for actively aggressive military purposes. But space orbits are used today for military purposes, to enhance military operations, for defensive purposes, for spying purposes. All of that happens in orbit, and it's not illegal. But the same would be and will be illegal on the moon, because the moon has a specific prohibition of any kind of military activity, including for defense purposes, including for surveillance purposes. All kinds of military activities are prohibited. This is important for space resources because they are under the same type of, let's say, prohibition. Space resources shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. This means that military entities cannot engage in space resources, that they cannot benefit from space resources, that they cannot own or receive space resources. There is a whole set of, let's say, consequences that it's important to bear in mind. There is also the possibility for these entities to engage in space resource activities if it is for exclusively peaceful purposes. So there is a second requirement that needs to be proven in order to allow for this to happen. So the moon and other celestial bodies will be peaceful resources, will have to be used for exclusively peaceful purposes. Then there is other principles. International responsibility, it's what I described before, the connection between international and national levels. Liability, if you create a damage in space because of your space object, the state that launched the object is liable. Jurisdiction and control, which means that you can exercise a limited degree of authority over your space object and over your personnel in space, not equivalent to sovereignty. And then we have due regard, consultation, and non-harmful contamination. Those are fundamental principles that govern how we're going to interact together in space. And due regard is probably one of the most important ones because it talks about how are we going to relate to each other. States shall conduct their activities in outer space with due regard to the corresponding interests of the others. This is a key provision that we need to apply to space mining. And then finally, last but not least, information sharing, which is the precondition for us to actually be successful at any activity on the moon. We need to share information about that. If we're not aware of what else is happening on the moon, the possibility of conflict, the possibility of interference becomes very, very realistic because it's a very harsh environment, very unpredictable one. If we don't even know where the others are, it is probably going to happen that we're going to clash on each other. And so we have to find a way to share information that is useful for coordination and cooperation. These are the international principles. They don't apply specifically to space mining, but they apply also to space mining. This means that they are there and they need to be implemented at the national level as well as at the international level with more specific regulation that tells you exactly how you're going to do space mining. 4 countries, including and starting with the United States, have attempted to begin to do that through national legislation, enacting different type of laws that will allow their own citizens, their own corporations to engage in space mining. But this is right now about that. This 4 legislation, except Japan, which is a little bit more detailed, and maybe Luxembourg as well, they don't tell you how space mining will be conducted. If you are an entity that wants to get a space mining permit in the United States, you don't even know which federal authority you will need to get a permit from, right? This is one of the points under discussion in Congress since now the enactment of the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. You just know that you can do it, but you don't know how. And until someone tells you how, you won't be able to do it because it is the obligation of all these countries to ensure that space mining is conducted in harmony with the principles that I described before. And for that, they need to give you conditions. They need to tell you, you will be able to go to the moon and get this amount of resources for this amount of time. You will have to respect these boundaries. Until a state has developed a mechanism for doing that, space mining remains theoretical. It's not practically happening. And in fact, there is no permit for space mining today. And if there will be one tomorrow, it will need to be at those conditions. So those 4 legislation are pioneering legislation in the sense that they give you the knowledge that your country is thinking about it, and they want you to engage in space mining, and they will give you the rules to do that. But until you get those rules, you won't be able to do it. And that's why none of this legislation is a problem. When the US enacted the legislation on space mining, there was a whole discussion at the international level whether that was legal or not. I wrote an article about it, and I think now it's become, the rule, at least the agreed interpretation from what I hear, that there is no problem, because what the United States did is just exercising its right to interpret and implement international space law at the national level. And in fact, the law says that you can own resources, you can be allowed to do space mining in accordance with the international obligations of the United States. It never says regardless of the international obligations of the United States. It says only to the condition that you can respect them. And that is where the next steps will be into developing rules and licensing systems that will allow a private entity to conduct space mining in accordance with those rules. That's why all these laws are perfectly fine, and they should be encouraged and welcomed because they push the discussion forward. And in fact, it was thanks to this poor legislation that now we have international developments at the United Nations on the governance of space mining. I want to go now quickly to some policy developments. So as I mentioned before, we have international principles, but they are very generic and they apply to all space activities. How are we going to translate them into space mining? This is done through policy. And there are three types of policy developments that you can interact with. There is the multilateral option. This is the United Nations. All states get a say. And in COPUS specifically, all states have to agree because the rule in COPUS is consensus, which means that even if one country is not happy, the rule is not approved. And that is a very, let's say, engaging type of decision-making discussions. Then there is minilateralism, which is only some states. It's a group of like-minded entities. An example of that is the Artemis Accords, is the ILRS, it's the International Space Station. The rules that apply on the International Space Station are decided by the parties to the International Space Station. There is an intergovernmental agreement that is concluded only by those parties that determine what jurisdiction should be used on the ISS, what happens if there is a crime committed, and so on and so forth. All the different rules are decided by the partners. And it's the same for the Artemis Accords and the ILRS. Rules and principles that you read in the Artemis Accords are not applicable to the moon as such. They are not a way to govern the moon. They are principles governing the Artemis program. And that is, again, another important clarification that has to be made. They are not an attempt to create another treaty or a subset of regulation for the moon. They are a way for countries operating together to find principles to do that. And that is perfectly normal, and it has always happened. And it's, again, it's a desirable outcome because we want those states to think about how they're going to conduct activities on the moon. And the Artemis Accords tell you, if you want to join the Artemis program, you have to respect those principles. If you don't want to respect those principles, don't join the Artemis program. Do your program, and if that program will be inconsistent with international law, we will tell you, and there will be a discussion in COPUS and perhaps legal action. And it's the same on the other end for ILRS, right? So those two are minilateral approaches. Countries that want to work together, they come together, they agree on principles, and they execute them. But it is not international space law. It's not about creating rules that are applicable to everybody. It's a different story. It's only about a program. And then there is multi-stakeholder, which is everybody else. It's literally all the non-governmental entities, the companies, the experts, the scientists, all the people that want to contribute to shaping those rules through their expertise and their own interest. Very quickly, at the multilateral level, like I said, since 2015, when the US enacted legislation on space mining, there has been an explosion of interest. This ultimately led to the creation of the working group on the legal aspect of space resource activities, which is led by two brilliant colleagues, Stephen Freeland and Andrei Nishtal, and they're doing excellent work on creating a set of fundamental principles that are specifically applicable to space mining. Watch the working group on legal aspects of space resource activities, because by 2027, they will release these principles, and they will be a fundamental development of international space law that you can also contribute. The working group regularly invites for contributions, and you can find all information on the webpage. More recently, UNUSA started to get interested on lunar activities as well, organizing the very first UN conference in COPUS, right before COPUS, but in Vienna on June 18, just a few months ago. And that was a very successful event. It was the first time that countries signing the Artemis and ILRS programs came together to discuss about priorities, to discuss about common ground. And that was very fruitful. It was acknowledged by the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Space that this event was extremely important and impactful, and that there was common ground found in many areas on international cooperation, information sharing, safety, and sustainability of lunar activities. And you can find the actual list on the on the website of Scopus in the report. And more recently, thanks to Romania, during Prunario, and other countries that joined this effort, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space established an action team on lunar activities consultation, ATLAC, which is going to start its activities next year on a substantive level to think about how we're going to consult for lunar activities and perhaps create a consultative mechanism. This is at least what it's written in the proposal, or create a space for states to discuss about how we're going to work together on the moon safely, peacefully, and sustainably. So those are very, very important developments. Then there is the unilateral developments. I already talked about Artemis and ILRS. One thing that I want to add at this stage is that the Artemis Accords are a set of political principles. They are not legally binding. You don't find the same type of document for ILRS. There is no ILRS Accords, but there is ILRS agreements, and they are more like the ISS agreements. They are legally binding agreements concluded by the NSA and the partners of the ILRS program. So, for example, there is one between CNSA and Roscosmos, and there is others that are in the making between all the partners that want to join the ILRS, and they are legally binding. So it's very substantial different because they regulate specifically how are these countries contributing to the ILRS program, whereas the Artemis Accords don't necessarily guarantee you participation in the Artemis program. They are a precondition to participate in the Artemis program, but they don't guarantee that you will actually do anything on the moon. They just say, if you want to do something, you have to sign this first, and then we're going to talk about it. Whereas the ILRS is, you want to do something, you sign this agreement, and your activity is done. It's approved, and we're going to execute it. And then there's multi-stakeholder developments. This is just a few initiatives that have been starting at the international level. I was very proud to be involved in several of them. The first one, of course, the International Space Resources Governance Working Group, the famous building blocks, then the recommended framework of GEXLA. We have the EAGLE report of SGAC that provides the views of the youth. And then more recently, the effort that I have the privilege of leading to this day, which is the Lunar Policy Priorities report with the Lunar Policy Platform we released just last November, so almost a year ago. Before concluding, I want to touch upon what is going to be the future of space policy. We started with legal framework that has to be translated into concrete rules through policy. The future of that, at least in my view, should be a governance system. If we want to make sure that we can conduct activities of this magnitude, of this unprecedented nature, we will need some governance. In order to be able to respond to the unknown, we need to know how to deal with it. And this is what governance does. It's not a bad word. It's a good thing. It's there to help us succeed in the future and avoid conflict when it's going to be too late. And this system has to be multi-level. Again, it cannot just be international, but it cannot just be national. It has to be adaptive. It has to have procedures to respond to change and evolve our rules as we go to the moon and learn. And it has to be comprehensive. That's why lunar mining is not just about mining. It's about landing on the moon. It's about powering mining operations. It's about storing, transportation. It's about environmental consequences. None of these activities will happen in isolation. They have to be considered through an holistic approach. This is the only way we can be successful. And again, we can operate peacefully, safely, and sustainably. At LPP, we're trying to contribute to this future by supporting actors with expert advice on legal and policy aspects of their activities on the moon, and by producing deliverables for the benefit of the community, like the priorities report, that will give you an understanding of where do we stand as a group, as a community, as a sector. What are the priorities that we agree on? What are the most important trends? And then you can learn about those and see how they apply to your activity. And we can accompany you in that journey by advising you on what's going to be the consequences of your planning and how you can make sure that your activities on the moon will be legal and will be executed in a successful manner from a policy viewpoint. So these are some of the deliverables we already produce. And then next, please continue to follow this space for working with LPP. This is the list of the policy priorities. I just wanted to give it up there before concluding so that you can take a look at what I think now there is consensus that we should be addressing. When we developed the LPP report, we spoke with about 40 stakeholders. About 30 of those have endorsed the report, and more of them have been talking about it anyways. And like I said, in June, the UN conference, Artemis and ILRS representatives came together and made a list of the fundamental priorities they have. And they fundamentally match this list as well. You can look it for yourself. And these are all the key topics that we need to address. But from priorities, we need to go to actual policy tools that will help us shape the future of space mining. And specifically for mining, from LPP at least, we believe that we will need to look at developing a catalog. So again, going from resources to reserve, principles, which is what the working group on space resources is doing, and standards. How are we going to conduct space mining activities in a standardized manner? This is what the LORS initiative of Carlos that I talked about before. So this is just one part of a broader set of tools that will need to happen so that we can be successful. Each of them individually will be useful, but all of them together will be successful. To conclude, I want to reiterate that for space mining specifically, we need an international lunar resource prospecting campaign. This is the next step. Otherwise, we're not even sure that we can do space mining until we go to the moon and prove in a scientific, in a valid and standardized manner that we have a concentration of resource that can be extracted in an economical and technological and legal way. Until we do that and prove reserves, there will never be any legal and business case for space mining. It will just be discussions, it will just be speculation, it will never translate into a concrete operation. No investor on Earth will give you 1 cent for an actual mining operation if you have not proven reserves. And to prove reserves, we need an international lunar resource prospecting campaign. You see the main actors that are proposing it. If you are interested, please get in touch. If you are an operator that want to contribute to the campaign, if you're a space agency, please do think about this because it's the next step. As a lawyer, I can think about how do we interpret the principles of the Aerospace Treaty. I can help you translate that into policy. But if in reality we don't have certainty that there is reserves to be mined, there's not going to be any space mining to begin with. So to conclude, today we have regulation, we have fundamental principles. We're going to go from that to governance in order to make sure that we can apply and evolve those principles in a concrete manner to space mining to ensure that space mining is peaceful, safe, and sustainable, and that it happens holistically with the rest of the developments on the moon. We will do that through policy at the multilateral level, policy at the minilateral level, and policy through contribution of stakeholders that want to operate and that are interested and have something to say about what are we going to do to the moon. And we're going to do that step by step. So we shouldn't rush towards the final product, whatever that is going to be, but we need to be intentional about it. We need to know what are the end goals that we have, and we need to follow a path that it's adaptive, that it's incremental, but that it's there. And I can tell you it's already happening. It's already in motion. 2027, we're going to have the principles from the Space Resources Working Group and further activities happening on the moon. And I think it's an exciting time to be alive and to be contributing to this sector. So I'm going to end it here. Think about what can you do. Think about who do you want to interact with. And don't forget that we're doing this for the benefit in the interest of all humanity, present and future. Thank you very much.
Nice. Well, others can't talk, so I'll give you the clap for you. That was excellent.
Thank you so much.
Oh no, it was really good perspective, and again, is a good sort of change of pace on some of the things that we've been discussing. So very thought-provoking. I think I'm going to have to watch the recording again to just really think through some of those further. So for those listening, any questions you have, please enter them into the Q&A. It's the little sort of button at the bottom next to the chat, and I'll read them aloud. But while we're waiting for a few of them, I guess my first question. So you outlined some next steps, sort of a broader next step is the prospecting campaign. Absolutely. And I like the emphasis on the resources and reserves. Prior to working in space resources, I actually worked for an oil and gas company. So it's also just very aligned with, we would never make a decision on anything that would be classified as a resource. And that's when, the cost to entry is orders of magnitude lower than the cost to develop something on the moon. So there are a couple of missions, one that's I'm actually leading at Lunar Policy Oceania with Australia's first rover is it's called Trailblazer, where there'll be a volatiles sensor on the rover. fairly local area, but kind of making that step. One kind of loss though was Viper. That's obviously been kind of a topic lately. What are your thoughts on sort of Viper being canned?
Well, I think it was a very tough decision taken from NASA, but I would not lose hopes just yet. I know that there has been a strong reaction from the community in support of keeping Viper, or at least transforming it. I know the colleagues at NASA Ames are working on it. I'm actually going to speak to them in the next couple of months. I think the role of Viper is going to be fundamental for the prospecting campaign, for the future of space mining. So I understand, of course, budgetary constraints that the NASA leadership took into account, but I would believe that there is ways to save Viper and to conduct the activity, also because the mission is ready to fly, from what I understand. So it's just about giving it a final push. And I understand that NASA decided that they don't want to be that final actor to do it for budgetary reason, to which I cannot, of course, comment. This is their own thinking, naturally. But I know that there is actors that want to save it, and I think they will save it because there is strong intention, and everybody understands that it's something that should happen. So I would hope that these efforts are successful. I know that some companies have already expressed interest, and I'm looking forward to seeing Viper on the moon for what it's worth, from my side at least.
Nice. Yeah, absolutely. We got a question that's come in. Great question. So how might space mining activities intersect with national security concerns, and what legal mechanisms can prevent the militarization of resource-rich areas in space?
It's a great question, and one that comes often, especially when I talk to the general public about these topics. So I understand that it's kind of natural to think that, based on, unfortunately, precedents on Earth, there's going to be a strong interest and perhaps attempts to kind of militarize or secure areas of the moon by military actors or for national security purposes. The reality is that there are no plans to do that right now. So just to be very clear, beyond what the law says, which I'm going to touch upon, no actor from any government has said, we are going to go with our military and we're going to secure space mining because this is critical for national security, or because we think that we want to have superiority and get control of the resources on the moon. Nobody has said that, ever said, I think ever will, because that's not the point, and that's not going to be so easily implementable as one may think. The moon is a very harsh and hostile environment. Every actor that is trying to adopt a sort of exclusionary approach will probably fail on its own, because I don't think today there is nobody that has the resources to actually enforce that kind of thinking on the moon with their own capabilities, because it's beyond everybody. It's beyond the budget of any national actor, and it's beyond reason to do it because it's not going to bear you any consequences. Think about the fact that also today it's not economically feasible to bring resources back on Earth. Whatever we're going to extract on the moon is going to be used in situ, because that's the only place where it's going to be useful. Also, the resources we have on the moon, they are not so critical on Earth. Today we have water. For example, the most important resource we have on the moon is ice. We have plenty of water here. We don't need to bring either ice from the moon. We need the ice on the moon. So if you're going to go and create a military operation, you're going to exclude others. Basically, you will have no customers. Who are you going to sell the water to? What are you going to use the water for? Keeping in mind that you're not able to do anything on your own because simply nobody has the technological capability or the financial resources to stand and develop that capability. What are you going to do? It's not in your interest. And then the law says that you cannot do it anyways. So there is a specific prohibition of military activities, including that type of militarization of territory, of resources, extraction activities, that is forbidden. So if an actor would like to attempt that, there will be strong pushback from all the other actors at the international community. And I would not underestimate the power of that. I would not underestimate the power of being blamed and being contested as the actor that is blatantly violating the Outer Space Treaty for the first time in history. This would be a first time. So I don't think, again, no actor in their own good mind, they will tell you, oh yeah, this is a great idea, because it's not feasible, it's not economical, and it's illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. So now the questions come in. So the USA, Luxembourg, UAE, and Japan, as you kind of showed earlier, accepted a National Space Resources Act but they acknowledged that the act should comply with international law. So why did the states enact that law under the restrictions?
It's a very good question. And it comes back again to that multi-level nature of space law. They enacted those legislation to signal to their private actors and to private actors all around the world that they want to encourage this activity, that they are, if you allow me, this is my own thing, quote unquote, open for business, right? So for example, a country like Luxembourg started a whole space resources initiative, the spaceresources.lu, which was meant to say to everybody in the world, if you're interested in space mining, especially in Europe, come to Luxembourg. We're going to regulate that. We're going to give you the tools that you need financially and legally so that you can conduct this activity. So I think it's a way to start advancing conversations in a way that it's compliant with international law. Again, it would have not made any sense for a country to say, we're going to allow space mining no matter what. We're going to give you a giant drill and you're going to go to the moon and do whatever you want. It's not how you build a business case. It's not how you operate in space. It's not how you're going to be successful. On the other hand, if nobody said anything, space mining would pretty much remain a theoretical topic, because it's only when someone says, okay, I'm going to start thinking about how to do it, that all the others will do the same and there will be a discussion. Proof of that is that after the enactment of the US law and the Luxembourgish law, there was the adoption of this topic in COPUOS and then a working group. And now there's going to be principles from the working group. And those principles will then be translated into national law into all these countries so that as an actor, you can go and engage in space mining. So that's the reason why I think it was to start the process in the right way, which is accepting that there are limitations, that this is not your own decision, that this is something that has to be discussed internationally, and that we're here to start that discussion, and that we have thoughts about it, that we have views that we want to share, and we welcome other views, and we're going to come up to a consensus. And this is how space law has been developed very successfully until today, and hopefully in the future.
Nice. Well, we're at time. There's two more questions in the chat, some good ones if you're able to keep going. Okay, I'll read them out. So a good one here, it's kind of multi-part, so let me know if you need me to kind of read part of it again. But what role does space mining play in the development of dual-use technologies, and how can international law regulate these technologies to minimize the risk of militarization in space? And what legal and regulatory challenges arise from the dual-use nature of space mining technologies, and how can international law balance technological advancement with the non-militarization objectives?
All right. Well, I see, Yuti, you're very passionate about militarization of space and dual use. So also for the benefit of those listening, what does dual use mean? Dual use is a terminology adopted in space policy discussions about essentially technologies that could be used for both civil and military purposes, and they are indistinguishable in nature, in the sense that the same thing could be used indifferently for both purposes. And therefore they pose a risk because, for example, the most classic example of dual-use technologies for space debris removal. Anything that is able to grab and remove a satellite, or to dissolve it, or to deorbit it, it is in fact possibly used as a weapon. You could use it not necessarily against a defunct satellite. You could use it, if you wish, against an active satellite. And that is the fear about developing active debris removal technology, because who's going to tell me that one day you're not going to use that technology against my satellites rather than against a piece of debris? This is kind of the general fear. Again, if you think about it practically, to me, I don't see a lot of scenarios in which a country will literally go and grab another actor or satellite, because that's, again, blatantly illegal. And it's in nobody's interest to do something so evidently wrong. It is much more frequent that if you want to disturb a satellite operation, you're going to jam a signal, which is very difficult to trace. It's not physically aggressive, and it's kind of in the gray area of what you can do under international law. So for me, the discussion about dual-use technology, it's again a question of theory. In practice, I see it as a very unlikely scenario that someone will actually use those technologies for aggression in space, because that would start a chain of events that it's not in your own interest, like launching a nuclear bomb. You may win that little battle, but in the end, everybody will be destroyed by it. And so there is no interest in really pursuing that, because it's not going to play benefits in the long term. Now, to respond to your question in terms of space mining and dual use, I don't think at this stage we are there. So far, like I said before, we don't even know how space mining is going to happen. There are several different technologies that can be used for mining, and not all of them are applicable on the moon. So just to give you an example, an understanding, and Joe, you come from the oil and gas, so you can confirm that most of the mining on Earth is done with water. Like mines are literally flooded with water, and then you extract the resources from a water-filled environment. We're not going to be able to do that on the moon. We don't have the water. We're not going to carry the water with us, and we want the water. We can't use it for it. So the most common technology for space mining, we won't be able to use it. We will need to use other different technologies, but the specific one that will be chosen depends on the resources you want to use, right? So if you want to extract ice and you want to turn it into water, you may sublimate the ice. So there is thermal mining that could be an example for you, but it's not a given. There are other ways that you can separate the hydrogen and oxygen and use them for different purposes, right? And so depending on the reserves that we find and the use, we're going to develop specific technologies for it. I don't see thermal mining as a dual use technology. I mean, of course, it is a very high concentration of heat. If you point it to somebody, you'll probably kill a human or destroy a machine. But again, I don't see how or why you would do that. And so I don't think we're worried about dual use technologies for mining in space. I think we're worried about unintended safety hazards that can come out of it, and we're worried about what this type of technologies can do to the moon as such. There is theories that if we start mining the moon, at some point we're going to modify the geology of the moon, including the composition of it, including the effects that the moon has on Earth, and all those kind of things. And so the use of massive mining technologies will have those kind of problems. I don't think it will create a problem that you're going to point it to a lunar base and try to kill everybody there, because again, I don't think that does make much sense, and it's not so easy to do, because those machines are developed for a very specific purpose. They're very expensive machines. You don't want to risk them in just very random operations for aggressive purposes. So I'm sorry that I cannot answer your question in full, but my problem is that the fundamental premise, I think, it's not going to be real on the moon.
A lot to think about there. And to your point, yes, we always kind of made the joke in oil and gas that like, really, we're a water company that makes just a little bit of oil. Like company average was like 92% water cut. So for every barrel, 92% is water. So I agree that's probably going to be the biggest change in how we actually sort of beneficiate and process things on the moon. It'll be interesting. And a bit of a plug, but I also think highly relevant, suggests the listeners to take a look at Lunar Outpost's first mission and fourth mission. The first one launching in a matter of months. We're collecting a small sample of regolith and actually doing an in situ sale to NASA. So it'll be the first sale of space resources. It's a trivial amount, but it's to help sort of progress basically everything we're talking about, like how do you actually conduct a sale of space resources. And then the fourth mission we're working on with the Australian Space Agency, it's actually a prototype behind me there. It's got a little scoop on it. So we're going to be collecting and analyzing samples as well. So it's, I get asked these questions a lot too. So this is informative.
Nice. That's great what you guys are doing. I think that's exactly the type of developments we want to encourage and we want to follow, so that based on the results of those pioneering missions, then we will be able to get a better understanding of how mining will actually look like and what are the rules that we want to develop so that we can do it again peacefully, safely, and sustainably. So kudos to you and Lunar Outpost and NASA for being very supportive of all these activities, creating opportunity through the CLIPS program for actors such as Lunar Outpost to emerge and do these things that 20 years ago would have been unthinkable for a new company, for a startup. And so this is a great moment to do all these things. And think about joining the campaign. I don't know if you already talked to Clive, but if not, you should. And in that way, we can also make it meaningful towards the rest of the community. Because again, the development of something like a prospectivity map on the moon, it's not something that one actor can do on its own. It should be the result of different approaches that validate each other and that can therefore have some statistical relevance. Otherwise, it's just going to be, a drop in the ocean, a guess at best. And so it's important to think about that holistic perspective if we want to be successful at this.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's pretty exciting. And we have had a chat with Clive on this, so that absolutely. All right,
Great.
last question from Yoti again. I guess this explains his great questions. He's an international law student doing his dissertation on space resource extraction and the militarization dilemma. So do you suggest any articles and journal for good literature review?
That's a question that maybe I can answer in an email, but I can point you to some sources, as I said before. There is not necessarily just academic sources. There is a lot of work done by international organizations and NGO. I mentioned before the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group. If you Google building blocks, you'll find them. I think they're going to give you a good understanding of what could be framework for conducting and regulating space resource activities. There is the work of GEXLA. There is the work that we have done in OPP, the Eagle report from SGC. There is also the work of an organization called Open Lunar Foundation, which is actually a partner of LPP. Open Lunar has been the first organization to believe in our efforts and to fund what LPP is doing. So we're very grateful to them. And they also have developed some policy considerations that you can find online on how we're going to use resources and how we're going to think about the implications strategically also of these resources. So I can point you to some resources on the Open Lunar website. There are some policy positions that you may find interesting. There is the work that they've been doing with the Breaking Ground Trust, which I know Lunar Outpost has been also working with in the sense of, again, giving some thought approach towards these questions. And then more on the academic side, I wrote a book about space mining. So I don't know if I'm allowed to do a shameless plug in a way. You can find it online. I can send you the PDF. I'm not here to sell a book. I wrote it because I needed to do my PhD, and I'm happy that it's there, and I want students to use it. So please do contact me. And I think in that book, you will find a lot of literature specifically relevant to the legal and policy aspects of space mining. I know that authors such as, for example, Franz van der Dank or Fabio Tronchetti have been writing extensively on militarization aspects and security. So you can take a look at that. PJ Blount as well. I can give you the names of great colleagues via an email. But yeah, there is good work done. And I think more will need to be written in the future.
Excellent. All right. Another one just came in.
I think
if you got time,
we can do that very quickly. Yeah.
Okay, we'll do the last one, and then I really do have to run. It's nighttime here in Australia.
Of
but
course.
good question to close it out. So the Outer Space Treaty prohibits national appropriation, but does not stipulate any limitations on private person. Under this restriction, the 4 states reason for their legislation. What is the basis for their legislation?
Yeah, it's a good question, and perhaps it allows me to clarify a further important aspect that it's necessary to keep in mind. Like I said, the international treaties on space law apply to states in the sense that states are the only ones that can conduct activities freely in space. A private actor does not have that freedom. Tomorrow, if you want to go to the moon, you will not be able to do that on your own. You will need to go to one government, to one country, and ask for permission. That country will need to give you permission and will have to supervise you and make sure that what you're doing is legit. It's in accordance with international space law. And that is because of the way space has been established as a domain. It's a fundamental assumption that we have to operate with. So yes, these principles do not apply directly to space, to private actors, but private actors in the first place can't do anything until they are authorized to do so. So Article 2 does not need to apply to me and Joseph or to Lunar Outpost directly, because neither of us can go to the moon freely. Neither of us have that possibility. We will need to ask a government permission, and that government is bound by Article 2, and we'll make sure that we are bound too. And if that government doesn't do it, the other governments will come and complain, and they will take action so that we are made to comply. So in that sense, you cannot get more freedom than the one that states have. And so whatever limitation applied to states, it will automatically be applied to you as a private actor. There's no way that you can have more freedom than the freedom that exists for states, because the system has been designed for them, and they are the ones that will give you a part of that freedom under certain conditions to operate. So anything will be less, but never more. So the basis is exactly that. The basis is we acknowledge that we have to authorize and supervise private actors under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. And we want to do that. And we do that through national legislation. And we will make sure that that national legislation is compliant with the rules that we, together with other states, have agreed on at the international level.
Excellent. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Really appreciate all the attendees for attending and all the great questions. And thank you, of course, Dr. Antonio. Been a really great session. Again, this will be recorded. You can go to the AIAA Space Resources YouTube channel and look through the past 2 years. And this recording will be posted soon. Stay tuned. We'll release next month's webinar shortly. So thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks to AIAA and to Jared for having me. It's been a pleasure doing this. Thank you all for the questions. Those who stayed here, those who will watch the recording. I think this is a very fun time to be, a lunar mining actor. So let's continue this conversation because it's just beginning.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Bye.